Um, I am really excited today to be speaking with Cary Mogerman, my first Top Gun attorney who I'm going to be interviewing about his career and his professional accomplishments. And God willing, if this works out okay, we're going to interview some other folks later. So, how you doing today, Cary?
I'm great, Steve, and I'm thrilled to be on your call. I'm
Uh,
excited about it.
I am so honored that you agreed to do this, and I think it's going to be a wonderful resource for other lawyers, newer lawyers, older lawyers to see how some of the best and the brightest operate in their practices and hopefully get some good constructive tips. So,
I'll try to play up to the intro.
all right, let's start at the beginning. All right, where'd you grow up?
I grew up in a small town in northeast Missouri, Troy, Missouri, about 45 miles north of St. Louis. That's where I grew up. My dad went there. He was a young surgeon just out of his residency and looked for a place to land and went there for a job and never moved. And that's where I grew up.
Old Doc Mogerman.
Old Doc Mogerman. That's right.
Yeah, did he do house calls?
I'm sorry.
Did he do house calls?
He, I think maybe he did a handful in 35 years, not much more than that. But he was a very busy physician there.
Do you do house calls?
Do I?
That's a joke.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I doubt it. So
I'll call your house.
how did growing up in a small town influence you? How did that influence your practice, your life, your personality, etc.?
Well, that's an interesting question, Steve. I think in a small town, it's a microcosm of any area, and um, I knew the professional community there. I knew the physicians and the lawyers and the judges, and um, so I think I was interested in the professions from the beginning. So that was one influence. Maybe it wouldn't have been as direct an influence in another area. I don't know. Um, and everybody in town. It was a very small school at the time. The community has grown quite a bit since I was last there as a resident. 40 years ago. But at the time, it was a very small town of about 3,500 people, and it was the seat of the county. It still is. So you knew everybody, and um, I just think um, it was helpful to me to be able to see what everybody did. And I guess that's about it.
Was there anybody in particular that influenced you to get into a career in the law? Was there one person in particular?
I wouldn't say there was, well, other than my father thought it would be a great fit for me. He always thought that I would be a good lawyer, and my mother as well. And uh, they had a high regard for the lawyers in our community. There were several that we knew, and uh, they thought that they seemed busy, and they thought that it was a learned profession. And so I think probably my parents more than anyone until I became a student in law school, I would say they were the most influential on
Was this a career path that you kind of focused on early and started heading in that direction, or were you
that.
wandering around?
My interest was in politics. I was very interested in politics growing up, and I saw law practice as a route to participation in the political world in some way, whether it was on the staff of a legislator or whether it was even running for some minor office or somehow working for a committee. But I thought that law would be the route, and that's why I pursued it. I think in college is when I became interested in really studying to be a lawyer, and that's when I took it seriously and took steps in that direction. I had a summer internship one year that a local lawyer helped me arrange in Washington with our local congressman. And that for me was the most exciting summer of my life. And I thought that I would return there in some capacity um, in government or politics. So that's why I pursued law.
So what did you study when you were an undergrad? Political science or?
Political science and American history were my two focus areas. And that's my degree was in both of those majors.
And where did you end up going to law school after college?
I went to law school here in St. Louis, Washington University School of Law, and graduated in 1985.
Same year as me.
I thought that was right.
Yeah, you're an old cocker.
Yeah, I'm afraid you're right.
That's why I'm
I'm afraid you're right.
So,
Every day older.
every day older.
Not that it matters.
Hopefully wiser. What
Hopefully.
what was your first job out of law school?
My first job, I began clerking for a lawyer in a nearby community, St. Charles, which is part of the St. Louis metro area. But not your St. Charles, which is different.
Different.
But it's on the periphery, and it's had a very nice professional community. And I took a job with an 11 lawyer firm there, working for a lawyer named Morris Stokes, who was a terrific trial lawyer, just a great trial lawyer. His whole career had been in defense work, civil mostly, although he had a general practice component to his practice.
Everybody did back then.
Yeah, and he did too. And his primary focus area was in medical defense, although he did asbestos defense, which was a small field at the time, and general casualty defense. And that's what I got a job for him in my third year of school. I had just completed the trial practice course and thought, this is very interesting. And so I went to work for him. And after I passed the bar, the firm took me on for a year. That's where I spent my first year.
What would you say was the most significant thing you learned from Morris in your practice?
Well, it's funny you should ask that question because that's an easy one for me. We had a number of really difficult cases. They were very challenging for reasons beyond the law. They were challenging because maybe the documents were, not great, or they were all askew, or they were challenging because the client was particularly difficult to deal with, maybe, or for a variety of reasons. But the reason I say that is because what I learned from him is that when it was tough in a case, he would just wade into it up to his navel. I mean, you have a fight or flight instinct, and when a case is difficult or unpleasant to deal with, sometimes we don't want to deal with it. And I mean, I think that the disciplinary councils across the country are full of complaints about files that sat dormant or ignored or whatever. But he was a guy, I mean, you could watch him do it. If it was difficult, he would just take a day and he would just immerse himself in a difficult, unpleasant matter that he had agreed to take and had somehow gotten crosswise with it one way or another because of those reasons. And so, and that was the thing, among his many attributes, that was the one that impressed me the most, was his ability to focus and dig in and make that case his case, no matter how challenging it was under the circumstances and how tempting it would be to withdraw or send it somewhere else or give it to one of the associates and say, you just handle it.
So do you model that in your practice today?
I try to, yes. And I have found that it works. I think anytime, frequently when a case is particularly vexing or you wake up in the middle of the night thinking about it, often it's because you don't feel as in command of it as you maybe should. And so whenever I have that feeling, I try to, make it a practice to set aside enough time. Maybe it's a Saturday afternoon or morning, maybe it's a Thursday, I block everything out. But you try to set aside enough time to wade into it and then figure out if you need to stay in it or moving along. But I do try, yes.
Yeah.
I don't know that I'm as good at it as he was. but I do try.
There's an old saying that if you shine the light on, the monsters under your bed disappear.
That's right.
And it's that same principle, it sounds
I
like.
think there's a great deal to that in every aspect of what we do for a living.
What would you say was your most memorable experience working at that firm? Was there a trial that maybe you second chaired or something that really sticks in your mind?
Well, I got to second chair a few trials. I had a very uh, varied experience in that year that I was there, in that we had a lot of different kinds of cases in addition to the defense work in different places, federal court, county court, the other county court. Um, I guess the most memorable experience I can think of was second chairing two civil cases with most of us and watching him work and watching him prepare. And watching him prepare and watching him try a case were two different experiences. And by that, I mean, he was practically elegant in trial. He was so precise, so surgical in his questioning and in his demeanor. Um, just really, just really terrific. Elegant is the word I would use. He was so good at it. But the prep was quite different. There was paper everywhere, and it was he was quite a challenge in the office to keep up with and work with because he was single-minded on that case, and you could tell he was not going to be embarrassed by this case. He was going to own this case by the time we got to court, and he always did. But it was a real experience to see. This is the part you don't ever see on television or in the movies. You don't see the flopping around in all the documents and pulling a book out of the shelf to check that case, or getting the people in and going over their testimony again and again and the facts. There was always some new fact that came out in those meetings. So that was very memorable for me, and I think it was a great experience. He
Uh,
was a great teacher. He enjoyed teaching.
Louis Nizer, the famous trial lawyer from the last century,
Right.
when asked whether there was luck in trial work, said, "Yeah, there's luck in trial work. I find it at 3 a.m. in the law library. That's where I find luck." And
There's a lot of luck in the law library at 3 if you're there. I'm sure that's right.
so after you worked at this firm, you moved on to another firm. What firm was that?
That was about a 50 lawyer firm in Clayton here in St. Louis. It was called Schifrin and Tryman. It no longer exists. It disbanded after a couple years. But I followed Mo to Schifrin and Tryman, the firm where we were uh, merged with what is now Thompson Coburn, and the three partners at the prior firm went with Thompson Coburn and became the St. Charles office for that firm. It's a large firm in St. Louis. It was Thompson Mitchell at the time. And but Mo chose another path. He took his practice to this firm, Schifrin and Tryman, and I went with him there. And I was with him until the firm disbanded, and then after for a year or two until I made really a career change into family law.
And how did that happen? Tell us a story about that.
Well, as I indicated, Mo always had a small general practice as part of his practice, litigation practice. And so he didn't like to handle the family law matters, and he always had two or three. And so I handled those, and I learned a lot about them. And in that pursuit, I met a lawyer named Alan Zerman on a case, and I was really fascinated by him. And we got the case settled. And he approached me a phone call one day and said, "If you ever want to make a change in your practice, I hope you'll give me a call." And I was very flattered because no one had ever said that to me about a law job. And I liked him, and things were changing at the other firm. There were some great lawyers there, but they were always older than me. And between me and the rest of the practice, I was the lowest associate. We had a wonderful partner named Kevin O'Malley, who worked with Mo, and Kevin was many years a partner at Greensfelder after that. And he became the U.S. ambassador to Ireland as an aside. He's a wonderful lawyer, and he's still here in town. But he would, so the next person on the list after Mo was Kevin. And so I was not going to take over anything from Kevin, who already had a good 10 years on me in experience and practice. And so things were changing, and I was beginning to get restless, I think, about my situation. I didn't think that our two big insurance clients were probably ever going to be my client. And for a variety of reasons, I was interested in this other opportunity. So I had lunch with Alan one day, and it was intriguing. And he was a great advocate for family law. He had started like other lawyers. He did everything. He tried everything, from murder cases to rent and possession cases and divorce cases. And at some point in his career, decided that focusing on a specialty was really the smart thing to do for him and for his clients.
And what year was
And
that?
the year he did that,
No, the
or
year that you joined that firm.
the year I joined him was August of 1989. So I had been with Mo for almost 5 years prior to that, including the time in my third year as a lawyer. And Alan and I were a year apart in making that decision. We had that meeting, and I thought about it, and then I thought, I don't really want to just do one thing. But in retrospect, it started to make sense to me. And my father was always an advocate for specialization. He said, it doesn't matter what you specialize in something, and then be the person in that. And a year later, I ran into Alan at the courthouse, and he looked terrible. He was working himself to death. And he looked at me on the elevator, and I looked at him, and he said, when are you going to come over? And I said, let's talk again. And we did. And that's when I started working for him in 89. And then in 92, we became partners, and we were partners for 30 years in the practice, just about.
So I want to circle back a little bit to Alan's career. So he became a specialist, or he concentrated his practice in what year? Do you remember?
Anecdotally, from him, I would say it was probably 5 or 10 years at the most prior to our association. He was already a very big name in St. Louis when I went to work for him in 89. In fact, when he became involved in that case I told you about, I didn't know any better because I did different kind of work. And I went to one of the partners at Schifrin and Treiman. I said, what do I need to know about this guy? And he said, well, you need to be prepared, and you need to know the law because he's about the best in town. And so I don't think you have that happen overnight. I would think that he probably had a good 5 years to 10 years of focus in the field before then.
That was pretty progressive in those days. Lawyers that were concentrating in one area of law, that was pretty unheard of in the late 70s, early 80s, from my recollection.
I think that's true, Steve, and I think that's probably the right time frame. He started practice the year I was born, 1960. He graduated law school at 23. And so he probably had 20 years of everything before he began to focus on the one thing.
So what'd you learn from Alan? I'm sure 100,000 things.
100,000 things. He was, we just lost him last summer in July. He passed away at 82. And that's a great loss, both personally, but, to our professional community and to his friends. He was just a terrific guy. He was very different from me. We were two different people. Our personalities could not be more different.
How so?
Well, Alan was very direct. And the most direct person I had ever met. Not unpleasant, but direct. And that was something I rarely experienced, but it was refreshing because I realized, well, I can be direct too. And I'm direct in a different way. I think I'm a lot more diplomatic, and he was not known for his diplomacy, but he was honest. He had he had so many really lifelong uh, what would you call it? A code that he lived by, and one of them was, you know, every phone call, always assume that the person on the other end is the bar association. Uh, your communication should always be ethical. They should always be honest. Uh, he was a great um, mentor about preparation. He was Mr. Preparation. He was very diligent. He told me that he'd once won an award for diligence in Sunday school, and I suppose he did. He was just I learned how to talk to clients and treat clients and respect clients in the court. I learned how to deal with difficult opponents. I learned what was important in the cases and what was really not, and just a ton of things. I mean, I could go on and on. I'll tell you, he was a very generous mentor. When I worked for him, he was always ahead of me. I never had to ask him for a raise. He just had this a way of handling things that was always first class, and I thought that was a great lesson. Uh, Vendors were paid, court reporters were paid upon receipt of invoice. Things that I learned later, not every lawyer does, and they were just that's how he treated people, and that's how he was to deal with.
So
In a
he was a
nutshell,
mensch. He was a mensch.
he was a mensch. He
Yeah.
was in every way a mensch.
I bet you miss him.
Greatly, yeah. There's not a day that goes by, Steve, that I don't think of him or think of something he would have said or use an expression he used, or my colleagues at the office will say when we have a conundrum, well, what do you think Alan would have said about this? How would Alan have handled this? So he had a great big personality. He was one of those people who had a big personality, not in and not in the way you might think when someone says that, a big personality. He wasn't a great extrovert. He really was an introvert. Um, it was not he spoke a lot at programs, but it was not something he that came naturally to him. He adapted to it and did a great job of it. But he had a big personality and cast a great shadow. I mean that in a positive way. You know,
Well, from what you observed of his trial skills, what were his strengths? Where did you see him really stand out?
he was he was an excellent issue spotter, and he was especially good at protecting the record. Um, and he was the one person I have met in my life who could look at a page of numbers and read it like you or I would read a book. Literally, he was the most facile with numbers of anybody I've ever met. He would look at a balance sheet or a P&L or a tax return, and he extrapolated information from that just like a vacuum cleaner. You know, I like to take notes. I like to study it and think about it, and then run some comparisons with other years, and then to get comfortable with it. But he could look at a set of numbers. It was a real talent that he had, and it helped him in every aspect phase of his life, uh, personal life, his professional life. Um, he was his leisure life. He was a great card player. He played poker his whole life. And in every context, his facility with numbers and calculations was a great help to him.
So you two are opposites, as you described. Um, what is your superpower as a divorce lawyer? Where do you think that you really stand out?
Well, I like to feel that I'm a good listener and a good counselor and legal counselor. Not everyone does that well, and you see people who are great at it, and you see people who are terrible at it. And I feel like I don't think you are. I think you're probably great at it. But I think that's a strong suit. And I think the ability to discuss these topics that we discuss with our clients, they're very personal. They're family matters, they're personal matters. And, we all have, no one wants to talk about these things. We all have parts of our lives we maybe aren't 100% proud of, or maybe not for any personal reason, but they turned out the wrong way and we feel badly about it. And I think we have to be able to talk to our clients in a non-judgmental way. And I have seen over the years that some of our colleagues, there's an arrogance, I think, that sets in with some over time. Um, it's a sense that I've heard this before, I've seen this before, I already know what you're going to tell me before you tell me. Let me tell you what you're about to tell me, and here's how we're going to handle it. And I find that very off-putting. And I don't think clients appreciate that, and I've tried very hard to avoid that. So I think that's something I do well. I also think I prepare well. It doesn't really come naturally what we do. People who do it well, it looks like it comes naturally, but very few. There are some, but very few does it, I think, come naturally. So I try very hard to be prepared, and I think those are probably the two most important for me. I read the cases. I think that's important. I
Let
think
me, let me,
sometimes,
let me drill down on that. When you say
okay,
you prepare well, let's take an example of a trial that you have coming up. What is your protocol, your system of getting ready for a trial?
well, I like to sit down, uh, preferably with the people who are working the case with me, and it's usually one of the other attorneys in the office, typically an associate, but not always. Sometimes the case may involve others as well, but and the paralegal. And I like to schedule a big meeting, a couple hours or more. And I like to sit in that meeting, and the three or four of us write down every issue that we think is presented by the case, both the legal issues, the the factual issues, the pragmatic issues such as how many days do we have to try it, what court are we going to, how we're going to get the stuff there, whatever. And I try to write down every single issue we can think of and then talk them through. And then assign responsibility among the three of us for who's going to do what. And then when are we going to meet again to see how we did it and what we did. And in that meeting, we talk about who are the witnesses we're going to need, how are we going to get them ready and when, what information do we still lack that we need to get, um, things like that. Uh, what do we have that we need to put in, and how are we putting it in? That's something that not everybody thinks about, and especially inexperienced lawyers or associates. They know we have this. They know we got it under a subpoena or someone gave us a document, but they never think about it until they become acclimated to our field. How is that getting in evidence? And so I want to make a list of all those evidentiary points and make sure we've got either a case on it or the statute on it or something, or the witness that we're going to need for it. And so, I mean, there's no science to it really. It's just, for me, it's aggregating information to a manageable set of components, and then working those components until trial. But you have to start. You can't do this a week before trial. You have to go back several months, and hopefully you've been working the case until that point, so your experts are already identified and they already have most of their conclusions. And then for me, I like to do my own witness notes. I encourage and welcome and ask for bullet points from the associates. Um, what do you want to make sure we cover. But I like to put it in my own order. I use a pencil, not a pen. I do it on paper, not on the computer or the the word processor, because for me, there's something about writing it down that's like hitting the save button that has not yet um, transposed itself to from writing things down to typing it. But it will. I'm working on it. It's a skill I want to acquire. Um, but in terms of the prep and the outlines, I write them, most of them myself. Really all of them. But I find that two heads are always better than one. There's always something somebody remembers that I forgot, and I love to get their list because sometimes they identify an issue that I really hadn't thought much about, and I didn't maybe think was significant. But as the case sort of gels, it is. So that's pretty much how I do it. We try to distill the exhibits. It's still primarily a paper medium in the county courts. Many of what I would call the new judges, by that I mean the new generation of judges, people in the last 10 years who've been appointed, they're more comfortable asking you to bring a flash drive or a CD with the exhibits, or they may even want them ahead of time. But we put the exhibits in either notebooks or on the CD, and I work out of a trial notebook that has, the pleadings and some cases and the witness outlines in it. And that's pretty much how I prepare. I like to meet with the client and go over the big picture of what their testimony, the points that I want to touch in their testimony and get their input. And then I like to practice with them a little bit, just the kind, how we teach sometimes, Steve, at the trial ad program for ABA and NITA, we talk about the conversational style of direct examination. I try to acclimate the witness, the client, and the witnesses to that. They don't know how it's going to be. They think they have to give recite, something, and it's not that at all. And that they need to get comfortable with the rhythm of it. So I practice that a little bit, and I practice a little bit of cross with the key witnesses, just so they can have an idea what to expect, and we can work on how to deal with it. And all that together somehow gets done by the day before the trial or the day of the trial. So that's how I do it.
So how many cases a year do you try now?
Many fewer. I would say.
By choice or by the judge's demands, or?
I think for a variety of reasons, but I think I've become better at settling cases, and I think the lawyers that we practice with have over the years. I have a theory about that, which I could go into if you want, but I also think the courts have very little time, and even the dedicated family courts are resistant to giving up trial dates and time unless it has to happen. And even if you get those dates, you get to court, and I think for good reasons, the judges try very hard to work out a deal before expending the judicial resources on a case. But as you pointed out in one of your books, sometimes, some families simply require the assistance of the courts to resolve the dispute, and those cases are the ones that get tried. But I will say that 10 years ago, I tried many, many more. I probably try 3 substantial cases a year at best now. Maybe some testimonial motions, but actual cases, whether it's a modification or a divorce, 2 or 3 a year. But 10 years ago, it was typically 8 to 10 or more. And it kind of started after about 2010. I began to see it, and my colleagues all report the same. Many fewer cases are tried, both in family and in civil, from what I'm given to understand.
I'm gonna take the bait. What is your theory as to why lawyers are settling cases more?
Well, at least in my jurisdiction, there has been an arc, at least to my way of thinking, an arc of jurisprudence. So we passed the Dissolution of Marriage Act in I think 74 is when it became effective. It was passed in 73 in Missouri, and it's our equitable distribution statute, and it was based in the Model Act. But you can almost follow it from 74 through about 10 years ago. There was an arc of jurisprudence from the courts of appeals on every topic: custody, property division, spousal support, child support, business valuation, you name it, evidence in family cases. Um, and I just think that it has, I don't want to say played itself out, but I think that there is now precedent on so many elements of the equitable distribution statute in our state that it's more predictable what a court might do. And there are fewer appeals, fewer opinions coming down from our three courts of appeals and our Supreme Court than there were even 10 years ago. My own theory, I haven't tested it, but it just makes sense to me. And I give case law updates every year, and I have for 25 years. So I read every family law case that comes down, and there are fewer. And the ones that do come down, there is plenty of prior precedent to decide the issue. So it'll come down to a factual issue maybe in the case. But I just think that the nooks and crannies of the dissolution of marriage statute in Missouri have now had a light shown on all of them. And there's a case on almost everything. And so I think that enhances predictability, and people are less inclined to roll the dice with the trial if there's plenty of jurisprudence on the topic. That's my theory.
Viable. Makes sense.
Maybe.
Let me switch gears for a second. It's a hard job being a divorce lawyer. As we all know, a friend of mine, Brendan Hammer, who is a partner of Berger Schatz in Chicago, said that if Mike Rowe were to do the Dirty Jobs program for white collar, divorce lawyers would be featured first.
A great point, Steve.
What's the hardest part of being a divorce lawyer?
I think two things. For me, it is always hard to have a clinical distance from very acute circumstances. And so there's a great tendency, I think, in our field to over-identify even with clients. And that you take that home with you, it sometimes suppresses the dinner conversation because you're thinking about this terrible emergent situation that there's not an immediate remedy to, maybe. You go to bed with it, you wake up with it, you in the shower, you're thinking about it, and you have to, as long as I've done this, I have to always remind myself and the lawyers I work with, remember now, we didn't create this problem and it's not our life. All we can do is play the hand that we're dealt and try to get the best outcome we can get. It's hard to keep that distance. I can remember early in the practice, Alan walking into my office and looking out the window in great frustration and just muttering to himself, I've just got to learn to distance myself. And I think it's a struggle for everybody who does this. That's number one. And number two, closely after that, is there is an adversarial element to what we do that is unnecessarily contentious. And I don't like to fall into that trap, and I really don't like it when my opponent is there. And so managing that is always a challenge, and it creates, in litigation, you're always taking a position maybe that's not in accordance with that of your opponent, and you have to learn how to manage that relationship without letting it become a personal thing. And that a lot of that has to do with tone and demeanor. And so I think it's a challenge to try to always have the right professional tone, and especially when it's not reciprocated. And those are two things about this field that I've always found to be a great challenge.
So give us some tips. How do you deal with Rambo who is taking shots at you and your client personally and won't let you talk and is acting borderline ethically, and you know the type.
Well, we know the type. We've all seen him or her, and I think a lot of it is relationship. So if I have that issue, I really try extra hard to be open and how shall I put it? Be the instigator of communication and try to set the tone. And sometimes a meeting in person does wonders frequently if you can get to their office or get them to your office. And I think if you can get to their office, it's uh, it's appreciated that you took the time to come over, and they need to know that they can trust you and that you're worthy of their trust. Sometimes that's all it takes. Um, but beyond that, in argument, it often happens in court or in chambers. And I have found if I am caught in that, if I can just focus on communicating with the judge, let the judge run this deal. Because we sometimes get caught up in sniping back and forth, and the judges hate it, and for good reason. And I have found that that can be very effective. It almost immunizes you from uh, being provoked into a statement that you'll be sorry you said, or that maybe is not the best representation of your own tone or demeanor. And it takes the onus off of me for managing it. As long as usually, if I can just communicate with the judge, and even if I just got told something that makes me want to jump out of my skin because it's so wrong or it's so fabricated or something, if I can respond to the judge and not take the bait over there, I think that's very helpful to the case, keeping the case moving forward, and keeping the judge's interest in what you have to say. Those are two things. Um, Off the top of my head, I guess I would say that those are the main things. It's never paid off to take your complaints about the other lawyer to the judge. They don't want to be involved. They want to get the case disposed of. So you have to really be, I think, creative and innovative in how you can, even if you've lost the relationship, if you can maintain it. I will tell you, I think, is this fair to say, Steve? Do we all have someone we think of as maybe our not our arch nemesis? I don't want to talk in comic book terms, but someone that is you repeatedly run up against, who you have just for whatever reason a terrible relationship with or a terrible experience with, and they would say the same thing. It- do you ever have that?
Professor Moriarty, sure.
Right,
Sherlock.
right. That's exactly right. So I had someone like that, and one of my associates was able to break the ice with that person and create really a whole new relationship between my office and that person's office. And that's been 5 years, and I've decided it took. And now I would rather deal with that person than some others, and maybe many others, because even though the position the individual takes may be disingenuous in my view, as always, and the approach the individual pursues might be a little less than forthcoming in my view, our interaction is always very civil and very pleasant. And it was not that way for many years. So sometimes someone else has to fix it for you. And but um, those are unpleasant matters to have, and they're hard to avoid. I know some people in town have said, well, I would never take a case with that person. I decline cases with that person. I mean, I feel like it's a service to the public. Somebody has to take this person on and figure out how to deal with that person. So I've never declined cases over the relationship. And like with everything else, I think if you just keep working it, you can, even those things you can fix.
That's your superpower.
Maybe,
I just defined it.
maybe that's it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Patience and ethics.
Maybe so.
Good.
Our cases are all like that, even the most challenging ones. You wake up and you think about them, but if you look back on all those cases you lost sleep over, they all work out. One way or another, you keep working them, they work out. There's a development of some kind that makes it so it can be settled or we get a resolution. Uh, you don't always know that going in, but it does seem to be the case.
I have a friend who said to me once, I flew home early from a trip to Italy because I had a very important client and it was nagging me and I didn't feel like I was ready for the upcoming trial, so I flew home early. And then he follows up by saying, do you know who that client was? And I, of course, don't know who it was. I said, no, who was it? He goes, I don't remember. And his point was, is what absorbs us as so immediate today, big picture, taking a long view, really doesn't matter.
Right.
So
Alan's
go ahead.
Alan's analogy was when you're preparing for trial, you're filling up the bathtub up here, and the minute you are done and you step out, you pull the plug, and it all drains, and you fill it up with the next emergent matter. And I think there's some of that to what we do.
Absolutely is. So, and maybe this might have been answered by your last comment, but if you were to tell yourself, young Cary, new lawyer, give yourself some advice based upon your life experience and career, what would you tell young Cary?
Well, I would say everything works out. As long as you do your job, everything works out. If you don't do your job, it won't. But if you study the cases, you remain nimble legally by reading the cases and reading the journals. It's important. It you begin to develop boundaries in your thinking if you don't keep following the cases, because we begin to think in terms of rote circumstances, and we handle you want to handle things all the same way, and every case is so different. I would say, be sure to read the cases, be sure to enjoy what you do. If you don't enjoy it, then you need to move on, because you're going to do a terrible job and you're going to be miserable while you're doing it. But I think when I think back, it was hard becoming a lawyer after law school. It was very hard at every court appearance, every big deposition. I was so anxious about all of them. And I still get anxious, but in a different way. And I think I have learned that everything works out. Even if you can't think of an answer to the problem, it will ultimately work itself out one way or another. And you just have to, it's a process, and you've got to keep at the process. I think that's probably something I wish I appreciated. I think I probably knew it or suspected it, but I didn't fully appreciate it until probably the last 10 years.
Good advice. Good advice. Good to remember. So, how do you keep yourself centered and balanced outside of the office? Do you have things that you do that kind of keeps your mind relaxed?
Some. We like music. My wife, Dee, and we love all kinds of music. We subscribe to Jazz St. Louis. It's a wonderful organization, not for profit in St. Louis. That they have a season like the symphony, and they bring in the top jazz artists from all over the world every year. We've subscribed for more than 10 years there. We go to the symphony occasionally. We like classic movies. We like to watch a classic movie on TCM in the afternoon. I'm a lap swimmer. I like to swim laps when the pool's open, indoors. And I've been very active in professionally in organizations. So that's been a wonderful thing for me, just personally. That's how I met you. And it's been a wonderful, wonderful relationship for me. I find you very interesting, Stephen. I like to read what you write. I read your blog. When you're interested in a topic, and you're interested in so many, it's fascinating to me. And I like the way you think about being a lawyer. And that's why I enjoy these conversations. I mean, we could talk all day about how you how do you do your practice, and what's your routine. And I hope to be asking you those questions. As you know, I have asked you those questions in a long car ride home one night from Kansas City, but to St. Louis. But I love meeting people who love being lawyers, like you, and people in the academy, people in my local bar. So I don't really socialize really much with fellow lawyers, but I'm very active in the activities, and we travel a lot to academy meetings and meet lawyers from all over the United States. Those lawyers that you and I teach with in Boulder for the trial ad school, it's wonderful to have met them. And we all have many of the same interests and many of the same frustrations. And uh, it's just been wonderful. I saw a movie maybe you'd be interested in.
What's that?
And it's been a while now. It's a Japanese movie. It's called either Transitions or uh, Transformations or something. I'll have to get the name for you. But it's about a young man who loses his job in some symphony orchestra in Japan that goes bankrupt, and he's got to find a new job to support his young family. And there's a guy who deals with the dead in Japanese culture. He comforts the families. He helps the bereaved. He's like a funeral director, for lack of a better term,
Or a divorce lawyer.
in Japan. And they're shunned, apparently, at least according to the movie, in Japanese culture. These individuals are, you don't want to associate with them. This young man didn't want to tell his wife where he was going to go to work for this guy for fear of the response, and he was embarrassed by it. But throughout the movie, there's a greater and greater focus on the individual that he went to work for. And you come to appreciate at the end of the movie that this is a guy who knows that not everybody thinks what he does is necessarily appealing or something that they would want to do. And sometimes people have stereotypes about divorce lawyers that are not very flattering. And it's the same for this guy. And it was cathartic to me to watch this movie and see how this guy, through his own personal discipline and his own knowledge, that he performs an important service for the families that he performs it for. And that was the message. No matter what anybody else thinks, this is really important. And that's how I feel about what we do. And I as soon as the movie was over, I turned to Dee and I said, that's what I do. And it is. I think that's what you do. Um, it's a wonderful profession. You can make a nice living and live comfortably doing it, have some good meals, dress nicely, associate with fun people. But in the end, it's really an important service. And family dysfunction is every bit as human as cancer or any other serious health condition. And that's how I look at it. I feel like we're not physicians, I know, but this human condition is never going to go away. There's always going to be dysfunction, and there's always going to be a need to try to have some kind of predictable process and fair process for making sure, the children still get looked after and their expenses paid for and the fruits of the relationship are shared. And I think it's really important. I don't know how I got off on that, I guess talking about that movie, but that's why I thought that was such a terrific movie. And it probably wouldn't speak to everybody, but I'll bet every family law attorney who watched the movie would say, boy, that's how our job is.
Well, if you remember, send me the name of the movie or a link.
I will.
So, and maybe I'll put that into my blogs so that other
I'd
divorce.
like you to see it if you're not familiar. I'll get you that. I think you would. I would be interested in your take on it.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. Well, I appreciate the time. Where can people get a hold of you at? You are on Twitter.
I'm on Twitter mostly for personal purposes, although I have a professional Twitter handle that I need to use more to post articles and things. But the best way to get a hold of me is at the office. I'm with the firm of Carmody MacDonald in St. Louis. I've been there for a year after 30 years with our own firm, and I'm very happy at Carmody. Two of my colleagues came with me and support staff, and we have I'm at 854-8711 here in St. Louis, 314 area code. We have a web page, carmodymacdonald.com, MAC MacDonald, and we have all of our bios there, and some of the things we've written are accessible there. I use email like everybody else, cjm@carmodymacdonald.com, and I guess that's about the best way to get a hold of me.
Sounds good. All right. Well, I'm going to sign off now. Wait around, Cary. I'm going to end the recording.
Well, thanks for having me. I thought this was a lot of fun.
Good. We'll do it again sometime. Hold on.
I hope.